I've mentioned this before, and I'm out here. The rain has delayed my returning home to Oma Darlin and them baby dolls, 3-year-old twins that live with us, and their mama, Morgan. And so, in between the rain showers, just to have something to do, I'm out here clearing up a little bit of brush that's down that had cleared. And there's a pine tree that I'm underneath, and you can kind of see some of the boughs here. I cut a few of the lower limbs off very carefully so that I could go underneath. I have a scrawny tree right here. You can't see, but it's about as big around as my little finger, and it's just by itself, and it's too close to that pine tree, so I'm going to have to cut that down. It's not a tree that I want to keep, and it would be in the way of this beautiful pine tree. Several years ago, pine borer beetles came through this area, and they just decimated all this area, all the way down into the Smoky Mountains. They decimated the area. And so what I'm trying to do here and yonder, I've got a pretty good sized one here. It's about that big around, and then there's a few more down here, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 in our yard down here by our cabin. And we've got the area cleared around those so that they can grow, because they will grow just so tall. And when I think about the theme that I use over and over and over again, that the mountains are calling, and I say it a little bit different than Ram Dass said. He said the mountains are calling and I must go. And I change it a little bit, and I say the mountains are calling, come go with me. And I wanted to make, that's one of those tree limbs I need to trim. I wanted to make mention of something that I've mentioned before, and I've thought about again. I had an early supper. It was kind of like a cross between dinner and supper, because I didn't have opportunity to eat at noontime. But I was thinking about something as I was watching The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings, the first in the trilogy that I was watching, and I will watch and enjoy as I eat and do a few other things as I'm in and out. One of my favorite parts is when Saruman is going into that woods, that forest, and cutting down the trees, and then the hobbits that are in there, they actually meet up with an Ent. And Fangorn, I believe, and it's been a while since I've read The Lord of the Rings, but I believe that's his name. And one of my favorite parts is when the Ents decide to stop just being dormant and move against Saruman. And man, that scene, all those scenes, it's just like, yeah, baby. And seeing the hobbits, Pippin and Merry, sit on top of his shoulders, if you will, and seeing him walk, it's just like, man, that's just amazing. And you know, it hits a chord with me, and the reason it hits a chord, and the reason I love it, and I love the woods. I'm out in the woods, even though it's sprinkling a little bit. The reason I love that is because when I was a little boy in Clay County, over on Little Creek, if you ever on Route 66 from Big Creek going up and passing Little Creek, Gilbert's Creek is on the left, and you keep on going, you end up in Beverly and up by the Redbird Mission Hospital and school up there. But if you are at Little Creek, just before you go over the culvert bridge is where my mama and papa lived, Steve Holland and Myrtle Holland. They lived right there. And that's when I was a little boy. I remember when they were coming through with Route 66, and the state didn't treat any of those folks right. They just kind of came and took. I don't know if they even gave them $1 for the right-of-way to go through their farms. And so Papa and Mama's farm, which was 80 acres, 81 acres, it was divided up by the highway. And the good part, the wonderful ground on the lower side, is where they would plant, and then just past that was the Redbird River, and Little Creek ran into the Redbird River. And my, oh my, oh my. We'd go down that hill to the Little Creek down there, and it was Little Gilbert's Creek originally. Felix Gilbert, John Gilbert Sr.'s brother. Felix is my great-great-great-grandfather. He lived on Little Creek somewheres. I don't know exactly where. But we'd go down, and there is a hole of water right there. Probably isn't even up to my knees these days, but boy, for little bitty children, it was a place to play and to swim. And sometimes my Aunt Bess would go down with my brother Mike and my cousin Vicky, her daughter, and I, and we'd swim. And sometimes we'd go down, and instead of going right to the little swimming hole, we'd go to the left and go through the culvert that was a culvert bridge and go down to Redbird River, and we'd swim. That was the big place to swim, and we had to be real careful. And Uncle Buck, my Uncle Bert, he would go down there with us. But the story I want to share with you, I've shared before. And here in the woods with the wind starting to blow, it makes me think of the story, because when the wind blows, especially at night, when the wind blows, you hear the creak of the trees. You hear them as they ache, as the wind pushes them in directions they don't want to go into. And you know something? I remember those stories about the Ents that I read later on when I was a young man, and I was 13, 14, 15 years old, first time I read those stories. But what I remember most was before my papa died, and he died when I was 12 years old. And this was several years before that, because he was still not healthy. He had been in a car wreck early on with my Uncle Buck, and he had had a brain injury that he never regained his full capacity from. And we were sitting out on the porch because it was warm inside. You know, you didn't sit inside because you'd have to switch on the electric, or as they used to say, cut on the electric, and you'd have to have lights on inside. But we'd sit outside, and if there was gnats and skeeters, we would light a gnat smoke. And we'd sit out on the porch, and it was late in the day, and maybe a day like this, I don't know, but the noises in the hollers and the noises up on the hills around Little Creek, around my papa and mama's farm, was making these achy groans, and sometimes it sounded like big things was a-moving. And I listened and listened, because when I was little, children, young'uns, were not allowed to just sit around and talk and carry on like they are now. And I listened, and Daddy and Mama and Aunt Bess and Uncle Johnny and my Uncle Bert, who we called Uncle Buck, and my Mamaw would talk. And sometimes my papa would just ask a question, same question, over and over and over again, because he never got back to normal. And he'd say, "Old woman, what day is this?" And she'd say, "It's Monday, Steve." That was his name too, Steve. "It's Monday, Steve." He'd nod his head, and a few minutes later he'd say, "Old woman," like he was studying on things. "Old woman, what day is this?" And with the patience of a woman that loves a man, she'd say, "It's Monday, Steve." And he'd nod his head. No, I'd love to just sneak back there and sit and just listen to the grown-ups talk again. But the story that's the most important story, the most important part of that event, was me listening over in the hollers and down by the Redbird River, and all around us up the creek, and behind us was that moaning and creaking and the loud noises that came from the trees. And maybe it was limbs falling, I don't know, but I said, "Reckon what that noise is." And my mom, who's not from the mountains, bless her heart, she's from Carrollton in Warsaw, Kentucky, right up by the river, by the Ohio River, where the Kentucky River and the Ohio River come together. That's where her grandparents lived, right there. So she still was a Kentuckian. you can't blame her for anything. But she said, Stevie, I don't know. And I said, Aunt Bess, do you know? No, I don't know, Stevie. Aunt Bess loved me. And then I said, Uncle Buck, what is that noise? And he said this. And I'm an old man, apparently, because at the Walmart, there's a little boy the other day on Sunday, a week ago yesterday. He saw me, and he just came up, and 7, 8, 9 years old. I've said this already. He said, hello, old man. And I said, hello. And apparently I am now an old man. I don't think of myself as one. But when I see my friends, I think to myself, Lord of mercy, they are old. But I said to my Uncle Buck, I said, Uncle Buck, what is that noise? And he was quiet for a minute, and he listened. And I remember he reached down, and the gnat smoke was starting to get a little thin, and it was sitting on the top, upside down top of a big lard can. And he kind of twisted it around and held it up so it started smoking better to keep the skeeters and the gnats away. And he looked up at me real serious and looked me right in the eye. And he said, Stevie, that's the trees a-walking. And I said, really? And he said, yes. Them trees get up and they walk around. If it's dry where they are, they get up and they walk. If it's not sunny enough, they get up and they move. That's why folks get lost in the mountains here, down here in Appalachia in Clay County, up on Redbird River. That's what it is. And I said, and the trees move. He said, oh yeah. He said, they just real careful like lift up their roots and use them roots to step and walk and move. I asked my daddy if that was true, and Daddy kind of grinned and said, well, if your Uncle Buck says it is, it is. I ain't going to argue with him. Mama kind of laughed, and Aunt Bess, I looked at her because Aunt Bess loved me, and she said, I've heard them too. And you know something? More than once I heard my Uncle Buck tell me and my brother Mike, who's 2.5 years younger than me, and my cousin Vicky, who also is 2.5 years younger than me. I heard him when we heard noises up in the mountains. And we asked, what is that? He would say, it's the trees. They're walking around, getting a better view. Maybe getting a little bit more sunlight. Maybe knowing somebody's coming through that ain't supposed to be. And they want to make sure they don't get to where they're going. Well, I think the trees call to me. Every time the wind shifts and blows and they go from one side to the other and they ache and groan, I think they're calling my name. But I think it's more than that. Because I think that the seismic movement of the mountains shifts. And yeah, you can say it's the groaning of rock against rock, but I think it's more than that. Because those of us, I apparently, as I've done genealogy, I used to think I was 7th generation Appalachian, but I'm 8th generation Appalachian. Those of us that love the mountains, we hear their siren song. Those of us that love the mountains may even hear the songs from the green hills of Ireland, whispering to our blood and our bones and our spirits and our souls. And maybe it's just the Appalachian Mountains that are older than any mountains here in America. And maybe those mountains sing to us. But maybe, as I've said before, and you've heard me say this before, maybe, just maybe, they're just repeating the song that our Irish and Scottish ancestors heard hundreds and hundreds of years ago, when because of famine or because they are the second or third son of dukes or earls were sent over here to make a new life. Or maybe they were sold into indenture, because a lot of Irishmen and Scots had that happen and had to come and work their passage off with labor for many years, sometimes 7 years and more. And maybe when they left in sailing boats and steamboats eventually, later on in diesel-pushed rods that moved propellers through the oceans, maybe, just maybe, they still call those Emerald Isles, those green hills way back home, call to the Celts, call to the Irish and the Scots, and sing the same song that the mountains sing to us. I don't know. But you know what I do know? My Uncle Buck, my Uncle Bert, he told me that the trees walk. And J.R.R. Tolkien said the same thing. I don't know where the Entwives went to, but I believe in the Ents, because I think they left Middle-earth one day. When that age passed and this age came about, the age of men, I think they looked around and they said, I like them hills. Of course, they talked about it in those deep voices, and they talked and they talked and they talked and they talked. And they said, let's go there. I don't know that my Uncle Buck ever read J.R.R. Tolkien. I think he saw him. I watch. I'm 69 years old. I've not seen them yet. But I've seen trees that look like they ain't where they're supposed to be. And I wait and I wonder to see an eye open up. And you don't believe me, do you? Well, we're going, and I'm going to show you. Because I think there's an Ent that lives right here, real close to our little old cabin here in Sunbright, Tennessee. Because its eye is open right now. But you know what? Sometimes I see this eye wink. So, I'm not going to tell you it is or it isn't. I want you to decide for yourself. Are you ready? There he is. Can you see him? Let me back up. Can you see him? I watched that eye. See his eyebrow over here? There's his eyebrow, and that eye closes right like that. Sometimes he winks. And you know what? Maybe it's not that tree. Maybe it's not an Ent. Maybe it's just God winking at me. Just reminded me that he's here. He's all around me. That he's everywhere I want to be. And someday, when I'm up there, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say, God, tell me something. And I'll look for my Uncle Buck, and I'll say, Uncle Buck, Daddy, Aunt Bess, Mama, Uncle Johnny, all the people that I know and love, Papa, who's going to have a new body and a new mind. I'm going to say, did them trees really walk? And I ain't going to be surprised when they all say yes.